Who was the hero that sculpted jazz, and how did he make his phenomenal tunes? The answer to both of those questions is one man. Being arguably the most inspiring tenor saxophonist of all time, John Coltrane was able to use the emotional drive from his involvement in civil rights acts to create some of the most touching tunes and albums that jazz has ever seen. Coltrane has changed the face of jazz, sculpting it to what it is today, and that has inspired countless young musicians to be the best that they can. Ever since his birth on September 23, 1926, Coltrane was surrounded in music. Coltrane's father played quite a few different instruments, which ignited his interest in the E-flat horn and clarinet. During his high school years, when he started paying more attention to the music of Lester Young and Johnny Hodges, that influenced him to switch to the alto saxophone. He continued his studying of the saxophone in Philadelphia at Granoff Studios and the Ornstein School of Music. After that, he was called into the World War II service, where he was a member of the U.S. Navy Band in Hawaii. This experience was where he first realized he was increasingly attracted to jazz music. How does one describe Coltrane's sound? I think of three adjectives: power, passion, and intensity. Those are perfect adjectives to describe his tone, thoughts, sound, and albums. His sound was almost angry, which was unlike his personality. Miles Davis even stated, "It was like he was possessed when he put that horn up to his mouth." Coltrane was actually a very quiet guy. Coltrane would often finish a solo that lasted for a few hours, then he would hide in the shadows until he next played. His humble demeanor would not give off the impression of what he could do when his mouthpiece met his mouth. Sometime around 1948, Coltrane started a tour with various band leaders such as Joe Webb and King Colax. During his time in these bands, Coltrane developed a very bad addiction for drugs, which would later become a great destruction point in his career. In November of 1948, Coltrane switched to the tenor saxophone. Miles Davis was unable to recruit Sonny Rollins to his new band. Then, he turned into Coltrane's direction under the recommendation of drummer Philly Joe Jones. At first, Miles Davis was very unsure of Coltrane. He didn't know whether or not he would fit in with this new band, and it was a huge step up from previous bands. Much like the way that Miles Davis's opposing sound had complemented Charlie Parker's nearly a decade earlier, Coltrane seemed to do the exact same thing with Miles Davis. The sound of this new and unusual quintet that Davis had thrown together was highly influential. This peculiar group seemed to create a new era of jazz, and this being the definition. Some of their most memorable tunes include Oleo, Round Midnight, and On Dolphin Street. Although being in this band with Davis had its benefits for Coltrane, he began to get more attention from the media than he wanted or thought he deserved. Miles was not the jealous type towards Coltrane's publicity, but Miles was forced to fire Coltrane due to the use of drugs. Coltrane did not stay down in the dumps for too long after this happened. He used this as an opportunity to reflect upon his life and make the change he desperately needed to make to lead himself into a more productive life and make the most out of the amazing talent and potential he had been given. With the aid of his wife, Juanita Austin, also known as Naima, Coltrane was able to fully kick his addiction to heroin. Along with his health improving, so did his playing. How did such a phenomenal jazz artist come up with these tunes? Did he perhaps dream about them? Did he write down the first thing he was hearing? Coltrane's songs, for the majority of the time, were not made by writing down the first thing that popped into his head. He had some great involvement in civil rights, so Coltrane used that as a way to make some of the most moving songs. One of the most memorable songs with a great meaning was the song called Alabama. The story behind this song is a very saddening story. On September 15, 1960, a member of the Ku Klux Klan planted dynamite on the steps of a Baptist church in Alabama. The explosion killed 4 little girls. The tune Alabama has no lyrics, nor does it need any. It's almost as if upon listening to it, a funeral is being listened to in the form of a tune. The lack of words does not mean the song does not communicate to the audience. It was rumored that the tune's phrasing patterns matched with Martin Luther King Jr.'s speech. Midway through the tune, when drummer Elvis Jones kicks up the tempo, that symbolizes the turning point of Martin Luther King Jr.'s speech. King turns his statement of sorrow into a powerful statement of renewed determination. Elvis Jones's drumming turns into a pounding rage that he wanted to represent the rising of civil rights tension. A jazz revolution. Coltrane had many great tunes, but one of them that stands out the most is the famous recording of Ascension. Why is this such an important tune? Coltrane was a musician who loved to play by the rules. Ascension was one of the first tunes that pretty much threw the rules out the window with the groove and the rhythm of horn interplay. Ascension was recorded with 3 tenors, 2 altos, 2 trumpets, 2 bassets, a lonesome McCoy Turner on piano, and Elvin Jones on drums. This phenomenally talented group was on the larger side of a classic band at that time. During this track, the rhythm section can be heard playing some quite unusual chords, but those led into very interesting blues solos from each of the players. This track not only revolutionized jazz, but if you follow Coltrane through his years, you can also see that it shows very clearly the path he was on. He was at a never-ending quest for personal expansion on the mouthpiece of his horn. Not only was Coltrane capable of changing jazz through the making of his own album, but he was also able to sculpt it into something else by recording a different version of the Broadway song called My Favorite Things. This song was first performed in the show The Sound of Music. My Favorite Things is a relaxing but lifting waltz in the key of E minor. This song is based off 40 bars, including 2 different sections. The first 16 bars are repeated once, then played 3 times with a slightly changed chord progression. Nothing too fancy. Then are concluded with the 24 bars of the second section. Coltrane's version of this song is completely different, yet it is very similar. First, the chord progression is significantly changed. Yet another difference is a slight one, but it gives a very different sound, the tempo. Coltrane's tempo is played a lot bouncier and more brisk, giving it a different feel. Coltrane's verse form is also a 10-bar verse instead of the original 8 bars. The additional 2 bars of a difference create a turnaround leading back to the beginning. Those 2 bars can also be used in quite a few different ways. I might use them as a lead up to the first section. You might use them as a conclusion to the previous 8. Coltrane changes the second section beyond recognition. He completely abandons the melody and uses the B section as an improvised solo, being repeated as many times as the player wishes. As one can see, Coltrane was capable of taking some of the simplest pieces and changing them into something a whole lot more complex, yet is recognizable from the original. Coltrane's impact on the civil rights. African Americans wanted to be able to eat at the same places as whites, go to the same school, drink from the same water fountain, and use the same buses. Music gave people a voice to express themselves during the civil rights movement. John Coltrane's Alabama was one upon many famous tunes that fought for African Americans to have the rights they deserved. In my opinion, I think the civil rights movements would have lasted for a lot longer of a time if it hadn't been for music. Songs that were written during that time were referred to as freedom songs. Martin Luther King Jr. stated that the freedom songs are playing a strong and vital role in our struggle. These freedom songs were a variety of different genres, including folk, jazz, R&B, and gospel. These songs were also a representation that they were not afraid to stand up to the government, though the punishment could be most severe in certain cases. Coltrane's leadership skills and his legacy. Coltrane was, of course, a great leader in jazz. He was responsible for modern-day jazz. He also taught many young musicians the ways of jazz. Not only did he teach young musicians, but his creative mind also helped to teach some of the musicians that had hired him, like Miles Davis or Dizzy Gillespie. He also possessed great leadership skills because he was not afraid to try something new and not have it work out. If he would have stayed inside the box, he wouldn't be nearly as famous, but it's because he was always thinking outside of the box that got him on top of the jazz charts. Not nearly enough people have this unique skill to be able to try something new or write down whatever it is that you're thinking. I think it was because of this that made him such a great leader in jazz and a great role model. The Coltrane legacy. Coltrane left quite a tough legacy for any modern-day jazz artist to try to follow up on. It's tough to think about jazz without John Coltrane. That'd be like trying to think of jazz without Miles Davis, or Dizzy Gillespie, or Charlie Parker. What made him so unique was that they were not just jazz artists who were alive in one period. These artists were part of a whole jazz progression, how it moved or changed or shifted. When looking at one of Coltrane's tunes, one might find a bit of simplicity to it. On paper, it looks easy, so why doesn't it sound the same when you try to mimic it on your horn? Because it lacks emotion. The one thing that Coltrane put into his music that made it have its own sound, there's a large amount of passion you have to bring to it as well, and that's had a huge influence on me as a player. If John Coltrane was only content with being as good as the players that brought him up or taught him, he wouldn't have gotten to where he did. He had the dedication that it took to give him his own sound, his own name, and his own legacy. He could have made the choice to stop at the levels of some musicians who taught him, and nothing would have stopped him from doing that, but we would not be talking about him here today if he had. Also, part of what contributes to his legacy, in my opinion, is the emotional intensity that each sound of his quartets had. As Coltrane said, you can even play a shoestring if you're sincere.